in the time we have left, we have a number of very interesting comments and some questions from the chat window. I'd just like to start by a couple of the comments by Donna Nelham, which were really interesting. In my presentation, I mentioned the need for a different type of thinking, but had no time to elaborate on it. But Donna has given a wonderful example of that. Because the kind of thinking we've learned is to choose between right and wrong, good and bad, one thing or another. And what she writes in her comment is, we have to learn how to reconcile things and find that they're not opposites to each other. It's not one or the other. The question is not whether we want a neoliberal, ultra-individualistic society like the US, or one that's autocratic and highly controlled collective community like in China. But there's a truth in both sides. And how do we build that collective harmony at the same time as we give the maximum scope for the individual development and creativity, which Janani was talking about? This is a good example of the kind of new thinking we need, and that's what we've been trying to work on in our own work in the academy. How do you bring about this change in social consciousness? How do you bring about a change that can really lead to a transformation? I'm not going to try to give an answer to that. I open it to the other panelists, but I just like to mention one of the things that we have noted, and we're working on a new project, but it's premature to speak about it, is, you know, today we have nothing like the voice of humanity. We have the voice of governments in the multilateral system. We have the voice of some major civil society organizations. We certainly have the voice of corporates, but we don't really have any voice of humanity as a whole, even to know what humanity as a whole really thinks on different issues. How are we going to create a common global social consciousness if we don't really even have that? We have the personal level, Facebook, where a person can communicate himself, but on private personal issues, but we really haven't built that up. So I turn it to the panel, if anyone would like to comment on how do we build social movement that is necessary to mobilize youth, to mobilize the grassroots communities for the kind of change that's necessary. I mean, after all, that's how the environmental movement didn't start with governments anywhere. It started with people who demanded a change. How do we build that up? Jonathan, you've had a lot of experience trying to mobilize social change. Can you comment on this?
The movement for gender equity, labor rights, environmental responsibility, civil rights, the idea that the function of the state is to allow the freedom of the individual, and the legitimacy of the state comes from the individual. I could go on. Every one of those ideas that has largely become the norm took place outside of government, took place within civil society. So I don't think there is any other way for a social movement to create change other than beginning in the heart of conscience of the individual, beginning with a group of people and spreading the idea. Now, the rest of it, as Kurt referenced the Bhagavad Gita, there's a section in the Gita that instructs the voice of wisdom in the form of Krishna, instructs intellect in the form of Arjuna, the proper way of doing social change, in which Krishna says, essentially, let go of the outcome, it's not in your hands. Operate with the purity of conscience and give the rewards and losses up. He suggests you give them to God. Give them to love. Give them to fate. But the idea of knowing the outcome of acts of kindness, virtue, compassion, justice is not in our hands. I would add, there are two criteria that we should use in evaluating any policy we want to commit to advance. And they're from two of the wisest human beings that we have to instruct us. One is Mahatma Gandhi. Mahatma Gandhi said, envision the face of the most disenfranchised person you've ever seen or could imagine. And think, is this policy going to be a benefit or burden to them? And then Jesus in Matthew says, I was hungry, did you feed me? I was naked, did you clothe me? I was in prison, did you visit me? Etc. Again, the most disenfranchised, the most in need. And said, what you do to that person, you're doing to him, to God. He's talking in that sense. So I think it's most important that we have that clarity in our own lives, clarity of purpose, and then full commitment, and then leave the outcome that's beyond our measurement. Unlike if you're in a business venture in which you can do management by objective. I don't believe that if you use management by objective standards to evaluate the sacrifice of Socrates, that becomes the basis for the importance of the rule of law in Western civilization, one of the great human achievements, where he says, the law has been misapplied to me, but I'll drink the hemlock because the rule of law is so important for the community. If you use management by objective metrics for Socrates, he was a total failure. Jesus says, by the time the cock crows, you'll all care less about me. Again, the metrics of the world would not apply. So I don't think we should use the metrics of the world for the matters of conscience or love.
Thanks, Jonathan. Another question came up from Tom Christoph. He mentioned the need for an accessible, lifelong learning system that would be affordable and all. Janani, just briefly speak about the project you're working on and why you think that there's such a need for a new paradigm in education.
In education, yes. The World Academy has co-founded the World University Consortium that has envisioned a global delivery system of education that can take education and make it accessible, affordable to anyone, anywhere in the world who needs it. We have the resources, we have a lot of information, but then given the growing demand for education, it is found that if we need to meet the demand, we will have to be starting one new university every week with 40,000 students if we are to just meet the demand, the present demand that there is in education. And this is not feasible. Physically, it is not feasible given what we have right now, given the model of education and education delivery we have right now. So what is possible actually is a combination of online and offline learning, the hybrid model. This has been there for almost 10 years, but the COVID-19 pandemic, it has really forced us online. And one of the comments I think today was, never let a good crisis go to waste, in the chat. And this COVID-19 pandemic has forced us to go online for education. Once we go back to a normal or a new normal, a combination of online and offline, where the delivery is done online digitally, and then during the physical classes, to the extent possible, if the interaction, the personal interaction, the collaboration, the peer-to-peer learning is done offline. This kind of combination, it is possible to actually just spread education to everybody. Best quality education can be made available to all, everywhere in the world. So this is possible given the technology that we have today.
One of the comments in the chat, I lost track of it, so I can't find the name, I'm sorry, but was mentioning the change is already taking place that we're talking about. I think that's a very important point, and I just give one example of it. A couple of years ago, we were approached by friends in New York and said, we're organizing a conference with the United Nations in New York on the future of capital. And the conference is on consciousness and capital. I said, are you sure? Are you sure that the UN is organizing a conference on consciousness and capital? Yes, they're sure. They have invited us. They have we are collaborating with them, and we want the World Academy to collaborate as well. And sure enough, it was a lesson for me. Maybe I've been away too long, traveling around the world, but it was a lesson for me because the UN, the people who were organizing it at the UN said, we have tried so many different efforts to talk about reform of capitalism and reform of investment. And it ends up always being an opportunity for somebody to sell their investments. And this is the first group. They got about 50. We had first group, there was about 80 people, people who are dedicated to a change in the financial system. And that group has surged to a few thousand people in the financial industry who are dedicating to how to redirect the investments towards the sustainable development goals and all. And one of our colleagues who we met there, who's now a trustee in the World Academy also, he's completing a study of the top 100 the banks in the world, the 100 top international banks in the world, where they are committing to a change in the way they're investing their money. Not 100% as we would love to have it, but they are disclosing for the first time how much of their money is going into ecologically sustainable and equitable, socially sustainable investments, and how much they're committed to make it more in future. So these are indications. They're drop in the bucket, they're just a drop maybe in the sea, but they're real drops of change that's taking place, which we hadn't seen up until now. And I'm sure others of you can share many more. There was a question by Kim Elia, and I'm going to open it for anyone who'd like to answer it. There was a mention of entrenched powers. I think I mentioned it, but I think anybody can. Which are the powers that are resisting the paradigm change? And the point here is not to point out and blame somebody for what the world is today, but I think we have to understand, as there are forces moving forward, there are forces who feel threatened by the change as well. So anybody like to comment on that?
Yes, the forces that are against the change are the forces that benefit from the status quo. So you take the military contractors in the United States, statistically, for every dollar they spend lobbying, they gain over $230 in contracts. That's the equation. If you take away the lobbying privilege, then they won't be able to do that. So it's institutional. The people getting benefits from the system are going to object to change. It's that simple. I mean, you want to identify who's going to be against the change? Look at look at the people that are benefiting from it. And yet within the groups of such people, many individuals would like individually to make that change. Certainly in the boards of directors of many of the multinational corporations, they would like to, but the institutional rules are antiquated. They're rules that were set up in a horse and buggy age. And now we're riding electric cars. The rules of the road have to change. The rules governing how success is defined, who are the difference between stakeholders, affected parties, and shareholders has to change. When we created general accounting principles, a bunch of corporations and militaries couldn't change the climate on the planet, even if they wanted to. 100 years ago, if somebody said, let's organize ourselves to melt the polar ice cap, it would have been too big a venture. But we inadvertently set in motion a system that privileged institutions that are literally burning the polar ice cap. We never expected to do that. So I think that it's really important to look at the institutional rules and the premises that they rest upon. That's why I talk about the two major institutions that are the problem: the military-industrial complex that benefits from institutionalizing adversity and fear, and the premises through which we even do accounting in the business world. The environmental consequences don't show up on an SEC report of a corporation. They're external to the accounting principles. All I'm suggesting is we bring reality. We bring the reality to the table. The reality is in finance, science, art, culture, religion, communication, transportation, the world has gone, and practical need, the world has gone global. But the security is focused on the security of the state, the military national model, not the people. And our businesses, instead of being focused on producing goods and services, have become focused on producing capital, which is the how, not the why. The why of business is to produce goods and services. But we've turned the why into producing capital for a small group of people, which is just the how. So weaponry is the why of weaponry is to produce security. But we've turned the why into the how, so we have weapons that are not producing security. The more you perfect nuclear weapons, the less security you get. We have a financial system where the more a small group of people entrench their capital, the more difficult it is to change to protect the climate. So we've got to get back to the why. And that's why, for me, at this moment in history, global conversations like this are really important. In 1640, when Catholics and Protestants were slaughtering each other over in Central Europe, people got together and talked about, how do we change this? Ergo, the nation state emerged. People don't talk about who was talking in 1640 about the change. Likewise, we're at a global moment, like Europe was, a global moment where lots of smart people have to be talking about these issues. And that's why these kind of conversations are so important.
Thank you, Jonathan. We're running pretty
Garry.
short at the end of this. Yes, yes.
Yes, two things.
No, just 1 second. Sorry, just 1 second. I'm going to ask you to speak. I wasn't shutting you off for sure. I just wanted to say, after you, we'll have one more speaker, and that I see that Hazel Henderson, also a fellow of the Academy and member of Club of Rome, is here, who's one of the most knowledgeable people in the world on the issues we're discussing now. So I'd like to keep a couple of minutes at the end, which is not fair to Hazel, because she's got too much to tell us. But Hazel, we'll take a couple of minutes for you before we close for today. It'd be a great way to close. Kurt, please.
Yes, you were talking of capital and consciousness.
Yeah.
There exist several groups that are working this approach. One of them is IFA with their currency seeds, where people are encouraged to develop community actions that are beneficial to the planet and are rewarded for that. That's one aspect of it. The other one, in big countries like the States, it's harder to see, except if you want to list among the different great obstacling organization, Big Pharma and others, which is right now in the center of attention everybody with the pandemic. But I would bring you back again to oneself. It's deep inside of us that it starts. You can see that in smaller countries. What people are protesting is the government, it's this and that, but they forget that the government is elected by them, that the people that go in the government and have all these supposedly bad qualities are the same bad qualities that they are manifesting in their daily life. They are doing just the same that they're approaching the governors to be doing. So there again, it starts with us, in ourselves, in our daily lives. That's where the change starts. It won't change by changing governments. That has never produced a real change. It starts with us. Thank you.
Thank you, Kurt. Hazel, are you still there? Can we hear from you?
Yes.
Great to hear from you and see you. Hi, Hazel.
Much, dear Garry, Jonathan, Janani. So good to listen to you all. I would just like to reinforce what Jonathan was saying about going back to the golden rule. And when you look at the whole problem of finance and the financialization of the world that has been going on, finance actually now is kind of corporations are puppets of finance. And so we have to really look at the fact that finance now is disordering every local social system and every local ecosystem on the planet. And basically, that we have to really engage with finance directly. And the financial system derives its paradigm from old economic textbooks and a very limited view of human nature, which they use, which says that human beings are no damn good, that human beings are greedy and selfish and profit maximizing, and that volunteering and what I call the love economy, the caring economy, which is much larger in the world than the market economy, they consider that as irrational. So if you program your finance and all your algorithms that way, you're going to keep replicating the 7 deadly sins. And I mean that absolutely accurately. Think of it: greed, competitiveness, acquisitiveness, envy, you name it. So if you incentivize your societies that way, of course, what are you going to turn out to do? Just what we've got. So I spend a lot of time now about thinking about restoring the golden rule, because that came out of the grassroots all over the world for centuries. And we at least need to rebalance that with the incentivizing of the 7 deadly sins. And I have an article coming out in a week or so called Reframing the Politics of Polarization. And I've really tried to dig very deeply into all of this. And so thank you all for this wonderful, wonderful symposium. And thank you, Garry, for letting me say a few words.
Thank you, Hazel. And for all of you who are not acquainted or fully acquainted with Hazel's work, I'd refer you to Ethical Markets Media. Her organization is so rich with material of relevance to our discussions today. Great to see you, Hazel. Thank you.
And we don't take any advertising. We're a certified B Corporation funded by the royalties from my books and TV shows.
And a lifetime of dedication. Great. Okay, I think we're about out of time, and I'd like to thank our panelists for very stimulating presentations, and to all of those of you who have been participating in the chat. And I'm sorry we couldn't get around to all your comments and questions, but there were some very thoughtful contributions.